The morning sun barely peeked over the mountains when Harold Thompson carefully parked his old blue Buick in his usual spot outside Sally's diner. At 93 years old, he still insisted on driving himself everywhere, though his granddaughter Sarah had offered countless times to help. The car, like its owner, moved slowly but with purpose, settling into the same space it had occupied almost every morning for the past 15 years. Harold stepped out of his car with deliberate movements, his worn Marine Corps cap sitting proudly on his white hair. Despite his age, he stood remarkably straight, though he used a simple wooden cane more for balance than support. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sweet smell of fresh bread from the diner's kitchen and the distinctive aroma of morning coffee that made the small Montana town feel alive. The veteran made his way to his favorite bench outside the diner, the one with the perfect view of both Main Street and the distant mountains. The brown wooden bench, weathered by years of sun and rain, had a small brass plaque on it that read, "In honor of our veterans." Harold had donated it to the town 12 years ago, though he never mentioned this fact to anyone. As he settled onto his bench, Sally, the diner's owner, was already heading out with his usual order. She was a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair always tied back in a neat bun. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," she called out cheerfully, carrying his standard breakfast, 2 pieces of wheat toast, scrambled eggs, and coffee in his special Marine Corps mug, the one he brought from home that first morning and which Sally now kept safely behind the counter just for him. "Thank you, Sally," Harold replied with a warm smile, his blue eyes twinkling despite their age. He wrapped his fingers around the warm mug, feeling the familiar comfort of its handle that had worn to fit his grip perfectly over the years. The mug, a gift from his late wife Martha, had been with him for 30 years, its Marine Corps emblem slightly faded but still proud. From his bench, Harold watched the town of Small Springs come to life. He noticed everything, the young mother hurrying her 2 children to school, their backpacks bouncing as they skipped along, old Mr. Peterson unlocking his hardware store across the street, and Mrs. Chen arranging fresh flowers outside her shop next door, each bloom carefully positioned with artistic precision. Some mornings, other veterans would join him. Today, it was Frank Miller, a Vietnam vet in his 70s who had been stopping by more frequently lately. Frank sat down carefully, nodding respectfully to Harold. They shared a comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional comment about the weather or local news. Both men understood the value of quiet companionship, a lesson learned through years of service and life experience. Harold's mind wandered to his time in the Pacific during World War II, as it often did during these peaceful morning moments. He could still hear the distant echoes of combat, but these memories no longer haunted him as they once did. Instead, they reminded him of the importance of the peace he now enjoyed, watching his small town wake up each day. A young waitress, Jenny, Harold's favorite after Sally, brought him a fresh cup of coffee. She was working her way through college, and Harold enjoyed hearing about her studies. She reminded him of his granddaughter Sarah, same determination, same bright smile. "Here you go, Mr. Thompson. Made it just how you like it," she said, carefully refilling his mug. Harold thanked her with a gentle nod, his hand steady as he lifted the refreshed cup to his lips. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across Main Street. A cool breeze rustled the American flag hanging outside the post office, and Harold watched it wave, feeling a familiar surge of pride. This was his routine, his peaceful corner of the world. Little did Harold know that this ordinary morning would mark the beginning of an extraordinary challenge, one that would test his courage in ways he hadn't experienced since his days in uniform, all those years ago. The peaceful mornings at Sally's diner changed on a warm Tuesday in April. Harold was enjoying his usual breakfast when the quiet morning air was suddenly filled with the loud roar of motorcycle engines. 5 motorcycles, their chrome pipes gleaming in the sunlight, pulled into the diner's parking lot. The riders were dressed in black leather jackets covered with patches, their bikes blocking 3 parking spaces at once. Harold watched as other regular customers began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Chen, who was watering her flowers, quickly stepped back into her shop. Even Sally, usually cheerful and welcoming to all customers, stood nervously at the diner's window, her hands twisting her apron. The leader of the group, a tall man with a thick beard and dark sunglasses, walked past Harold's bench. A patch on his jacket read "Snake." He looked down at Harold, deliberately blowing cigarette smoke in the old veteran's direction. Harold didn't move, keeping his eyes forward and his hands steady around his coffee mug. "Nice bench you got here, old-timer," Snake said with a smirk. His voice was rough, like gravel under boots. The other four bikers laughed, their heavy boots scraping against the concrete as they followed their leader into the diner. The bell above the door rang sharply as they entered, much louder than its usual gentle chime. Inside, Harold could hear their loud voices ordering breakfast. Jenny, the young waitress, was serving them. Her usual confident smile was replaced with a nervous look as she wrote down their orders. Sally watched from behind the counter, her phone close by, ready to call for help if needed. The next morning, Harold arrived at his usual time, but something felt different. The peaceful atmosphere of the diner was gone. Instead of the usual morning chatter and gentle clinking of coffee cups, there was an uneasy silence. The regulars kept looking over their shoulders, waiting for the bikers to return. They didn't have to wait long. By 9 o'clock, the roar of motorcycles filled the air again. This time, there were 8 of them. They parked their bikes in a semicircle around Harold's bench, the engines running longer than necessary, filling the air with exhaust fumes. Frank Miller, Harold's veteran friend, arrived just then. He saw what was happening and sat down next to Harold, his jaw tight with anger. "Want me to call the police, Harold?" he whispered. Harold shook his head slightly, his eyes still focused on the mountains in the distance. The bikers made themselves at home in the diner, taking up the largest booth. Their loud laughter and rough language made other customers uncomfortable. A young mother quickly finished her breakfast and hurried out with her 2 children, trying not to make eye contact with anyone. As the week went on, the situation got worse. Regular customers started avoiding the diner during the morning hours. Sally's business began to suffer. The bikers seemed to enjoy the power they had over the peaceful town spot, especially when it came to making Harold uncomfortable. They would purposely park closer to his bench each day, sometimes revving their engines when he was trying to drink his coffee. They made loud jokes about retirement homes and old soldiers. But Harold never changed his routine. He sat there each morning, straight-backed and calm, his Marine Corps mug held firmly in his weathered hands. One morning, Snake walked up to Harold's bench and sat down uninvited, spreading his arms across the back of the bench. "You know, old man," he said, his voice mock-friendly, "most people would have found a new breakfast spot by now." Harold turned slightly, looking at Snake for the first time. His blue eyes were clear and steady, showing no fear. The other customers watched nervously, expecting trouble. Frank Miller stood up from his table inside the diner, ready to help his friend. But Harold simply took another sip of his coffee, his movements deliberate and controlled. The morning sun caught the Marine Corps emblem on his mug, making it shine briefly. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. No one knew it then, but this silent moment between the old Marine and the biker leader was just the beginning of a confrontation that would change everything at Sally's diner. The morning started like any other at Sally's diner, but there was tension in the air. Harold sat on his bench, watching the sun rise over the mountains, when he heard the now familiar rumble of motorcycles approaching. Today, however, was different. Instead of their usual 8 bikes, there were 12 motorcycles roaring into the parking lot. Snake, wearing a new leather vest with a large skull patch, led his group directly toward Harold's bench. The old veteran noticed how some of the newer bikers looked barely older than his youngest grandson. They moved in a tight group, surrounding the bench where Harold sat with his morning coffee. "Stand up, old-timer," Snake commanded, towering over Harold. The other bikers formed a half-circle, creating a wall of leather and denim. Inside the diner, Sally reached for her phone, but stopped when she saw Harold slowly shake his head. He didn't want any trouble that might put others at risk. Harold took his time, carefully setting down his Marine Corps mug on the bench. His movements were deliberate and calm, just as they had been during his years of military service. The morning sun caught his veteran's pin, making it shine briefly against his worn jacket. "You seem to have a problem with me sitting here," Harold said quietly, his voice steady despite his age. His blue eyes met Snake's gaze without flinching. Some of the younger bikers shifted uncomfortably, not expecting such calmness from the elderly man. Snake pulled out a pack of cigarettes, lit one, and deliberately blew smoke toward Harold's face. "Yeah, we got a problem," he growled. "This is our spot now. Times change, old man. Maybe it's time for you to find somewhere else to drink your coffee." Harold stood straighter, his full height impressive despite his 93 years. The wooden cane in his hand could have been a soldier's staff, the way he held it. "I've been sitting on this bench since before some of your friends were born," he replied, looking at the younger bikers. "I've seen bullies before, son. Faced them on beaches far from here, where the stakes were much higher than a parking spot." One of the younger bikers, a thin man with a red bandana, stepped forward. "You threatening us, old man?" he asked, trying to sound tough, but his voice wavering slightly. Several customers had come out of the diner now, watching the scene unfold. Harold smiled slightly, the kind of smile that held years of wisdom behind it. "No threats needed," he said. "I learned long ago that real strength isn't about intimidation. It's about standing your ground when it matters." Snake took a step closer, his boots scraping against the concrete. "Big words from an old man who can barely stand without a cane," he sneered, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Something about Harold's calm demeanor had thrown him off balance. Just then, Frank Miller appeared beside Harold, followed by two other veterans who regularly visited the diner. They didn't say anything, just stood there quietly, showing their support. The morning breeze carried the smell of Sally's fresh coffee and newly baked bread, a peaceful scent in the tense atmosphere. "You know what's interesting?" Harold said, looking directly at Snake. "Every morning, I sit here and watch people go about their lives. I see kindness, community, and respect. Then you folks showed up, thinking fear makes you strong. But I learned something important in the Pacific. Bullies are usually the ones most afraid of something." Snake's face reddened, but before he could respond, a police car slowly cruised by, Officer Martinez at the wheel. He didn't stop, just drove past, but his presence was enough to make the bikers step back slightly. Harold used this moment to sit back down, picking up his coffee mug with steady hands. "You're making a mistake, old man." Snake growled, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. He gestured to his group, and they began moving back to their motorcycles. The rumble of engines filled the air again as they pulled out of the parking lot, but everyone knew this wasn't over. As the sound of motorcycles faded, Sally hurried out with a fresh cup of coffee for Harold. The regular customers began returning to their tables, but there was a new respect in how they looked at the old veteran. Harold simply sat there, sipping his coffee, watching the morning sun climb higher over the mountains. The first real confrontation was over, but he knew there would be more to come. The situation at Sally's diner grew more serious with each passing day. Harold noticed how the bikers had begun to affect not just his peaceful mornings, but the entire neighborhood. From his bench, he watched as their behavior became increasingly bold and threatening. Mrs. Chen's flower shop, once bright with colorful blooms and happy customers, now stood quiet most mornings. The elderly Chinese woman, who had run her shop for 30 years, started keeping her door locked, only opening it when she recognized the customer. Harold saw how she flinched every time the motorcycles roared past her windows, making her delicate orchids tremble on their shelves. One morning, as Harold sipped his coffee, he watched a young mother trying to park her minivan. 3 motorcycles were spread across 5 parking spaces, leaving little room for other vehicles. The woman, struggling with a baby carrier and holding her young daughter's hand, had to park far down the street. The bikers lounged against their machines, laughing as she walked past them in the light rain. Inside the diner, business was suffering. Sally's usual breakfast rush had dwindled to a handful of brave regulars. Harold could see the worry in Sally's eyes as she counted her daily receipts, which grew smaller each day. Jenny, the young waitress saving for college, had her hours cut because there weren't enough customers to serve. "It's getting bad, Harold?" Sally confided in him one quiet morning, refilling his coffee cup. "2 of my regular delivery drivers quit last week. They say they don't feel safe making morning deliveries anymore." Her hands trembled slightly as she poured, something Harold had never seen before. The bikers had started showing up earlier each day, almost matching Harold's early arrival time. They seemed to take special pleasure in disrupting the peace of the early morning hours. Their motorcycles grew louder, their language more offensive, and their presence more intimidating. Frank Miller stopped by less frequently now, explaining that his doctor had advised him to avoid stress. "But I worry about you out here alone, Harold," he said during one of his visits. Harold just nodded, understanding his friend's concern but refusing to change his own routine. One particularly tense morning, Snake and his gang arrived just as Mr. Peterson was opening his hardware store. The elderly shopkeeper fumbled with his keys, rushing to get inside as the bikers revved their engines. One of them knocked over his display of garden tools, scattering them across the sidewalk. They laughed as the old man struggled to pick everything up. Harold watched all of this from his bench, his coffee growing cold in his hands. He saw how Snake's group had grown to 15 members now, some looking like trouble from bigger cities. Their patches and leather vests carried symbols that spoke of connections to larger, more dangerous motorcycle groups. Officer Martinez drove by more frequently, but even his presence didn't seem to deter the bikers anymore. They would just lower their voices and watch his patrol car pass, resuming their disruptive behavior as soon as he was out of sight. The breaking point came when Harold overheard two of the younger bikers planning to decorate Mrs. Chen's shop front after hours. Their idea of decoration involved spray paint and broken windows. The old veteran's hands tightened around his coffee mug as he listened, remembering similar threats from his youth, before he joined the Marines. That evening, after the diner had closed, Sally found Harold still sitting on his bench, watching the sunset. "Mr. Thompson," she said softly, "maybe it's time to find another spot for your morning coffee. I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you." Harold looked up at her kind face, seeing the genuine concern in her eyes. "Sally," he replied, his voice firm despite his age, "running from bullies only makes them bolder. Sometimes, standing your ground isn't just about yourself, it's about everyone who can't stand up for themselves." As the streetlights came on and the evening shadows grew longer, Harold knew he had to do something. Not just for himself, but for Mrs. Chen, Sally, Jenny, and everyone else affected by the bikers' reign of terror. The next morning would bring change, one way or another. The morning that changed everything started with rain. Heavy drops fell from dark clouds as Harold parked his Buick in his usual spot. The old veteran noticed that Mrs. Chen was already outside her flower shop, struggling to move her delicate plants under cover before the weather could damage them. Just then, the familiar roar of motorcycles cut through the rain. Snake and his gang arrived earlier than usual, their bikes spraying water as they pulled into the parking lot. Harold watched as they deliberately rode close to Mrs. Chen's flower display, the water from their wheels soaking both her and her precious flowers. "Oh no, please!" Mrs. Chen cried out as several potted orchids fell to the ground, their ceramic pots shattering on the wet sidewalk. The bikers just laughed, parking their motorcycles in a semicircle that blocked both her shop entrance and the diner's front door. Harold felt something shift inside him. The scene before him brought back memories from his youth, before he joined the Marines. He remembered watching bullies terrorize his own neighborhood in 1944, how people lived in fear until someone finally took a stand. His hands, still holding his Marine Corps mug, stopped trembling. Snake stepped off his motorcycle, shaking rain from his leather jacket. "Looks like someone's having a bad morning," he sneered, deliberately kicking a broken flower pot aside. The other bikers laughed again, but some of the younger ones looked uncomfortable with targeting the elderly woman. Inside the diner, Sally was on the phone, likely calling the police. Jenny stood at the window, tears in her eyes as she watched Mrs. Chen try to salvage what she could of her ruined flowers. The rain continued to fall, mixing with the soil and broken pottery on the sidewalk. Harold slowly set his coffee mug down on his bench. The sound of the ceramic touching wood seemed unusually loud in the tense atmosphere. With deliberate movements, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his worn leather wallet. 78 years, he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the rain. Snake and his gang turned to look at the old veteran. "That's how long I've been standing up to bullies like you." Harold stood up straight, his cane planted firmly on the wet ground. The rain ran down his face, but he didn't seem to notice. One by one, he began removing old photographs from his wallet, holding them carefully to protect them from the rain. "This one," he said, holding up a faded picture, "was taken the day after I earned my Marine Corps badge. I was 18, just a kid really." His voice grew stronger with each word. "And this one was taken on Iwo Jima, where I learned what real courage looks like." The bikers stood silently now, the rain drumming on their leather jackets. Even Snake seemed unsure how to respond to this unexpected turn of events. Harold continued pulling out photographs, each one telling a story of service, courage, and standing up against intimidation. Mrs. Chen had stopped trying to save her flowers. She stood watching Harold, her eyes wide with surprise and hope. Inside the diner, customers pressed against the windows, witnessing the scene unfold. But this photograph, Harold said, holding up one final, more recent picture, this one might interest you most. Snake. His blue eyes locked with the biker leaders. Because the young man standing next to me in this picture became someone you know very well. Snake stepped closer, squinting at the photograph through the rain. His face suddenly went pale, recognition dawning in his eyes. The other bikers moved forward too, curious about what could make their leader look so shaken. The rain began to ease, but the tension in the air remained thick. Harold stood his ground, the photographs in his steady hands telling a story that would change everything. The breaking point had arrived, but not in the way anyone had expected. As Officer Martinez's patrol car turned the corner, its lights flashing, Harold knew that this moment would mark either the beginning of positive change or the start of an even bigger conflict. Either way, he was ready to face whatever came next. The photograph in Harold's hand trembled slightly in the morning breeze. Snake stared at it, his tough guy expression cracking like old paint. In the picture, a younger Harold stood next to a teenage boy in a graduation gown, both smiling proudly at the camera. That's my Uncle Mike, Snake said, his voice barely above a whisper. The other bikers gathered closer, trying to see the photograph that had such an effect on their leader. Harold nodded slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on Snake's face. Michael Thompson, Harold said clearly. He was my first success story at the Veterans Center. A troubled kid who lost his father in Vietnam. He came to us angry at the world, much like you seem to be now. Harold's voice carried across the parking lot, strong and steady. Snake's hands clenched into fists, then relaxed. Uncle Mike never told me. He started, then stopped. Harold pulled out more photographs from his wallet, laying them carefully on his bench despite the lingering raindrops. Your uncle wasn't the only one, Harold continued. For 40 years, I've worked with young men at the Veterans Center. Some were lost, some angry, some just needed direction. He pointed to different photographs. That's Johnny Martinez. He's a police surgeon now. And there's David Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew. He owns 3 successful restaurants in the city. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, looking at the pictures. David? She said softly. You helped my David? Her eyes filled with tears as she remembered how her troubled nephew had transformed his life years ago. Snake picked up one of the photographs, handling it carefully despite his rough appearance. Uncle Mike said someone helped him turn his life around, he said quietly. Said this man taught him about real strength, about standing up for others instead of pushing them down. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, looking at the scattered flowers and broken pots on the sidewalk. Jenny came out of the diner carrying a broom and dustpan, starting to clean up the mess. To everyone's surprise, 2 of the younger bikers stepped forward to help her. Harold watched this small act of kindness with approval. Your uncle learned that true respect isn't earned through fear, he said to Snake. It's earned through actions that lift others up, not tear them down. Snake handed the photograph back to Harold, his movements unusually gentle. Uncle Mike owns his own business now, he said, almost of himself. Has 3 kids in college. I always wondered how he did it, how he got out of the life he was heading toward. Harold sat back down on his bench, arranging the photographs carefully. The Veterans Center is still open, he said quietly. Every Tuesday and Thursday, just like always. We help anyone who wants to find a better path, veteran or not. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Jenny and the 2 bikers sweeping up broken pottery. Snake looked around the parking lot, seeing it through new eyes. The diner where families should feel safe, Mrs. Chen's flower shop that added beauty to the street, and the old veteran who had helped shape so many lives, including his own uncle's. I'm sorry, Snake said finally, the words seeming to surprise even him. He turned to Mrs. Chen. We'll pay for the damages. And he hesitated, then continued, we'll help you replant everything. Harold watched as Snake's words sparked a transformation in the parking lot. More bikers stepped forward to help clean up. Inside the diner, Sally wiped tears from her eyes as she watched through the window. Officer Martinez, who had been watching from his patrol car, smiled and drove away, knowing his intervention wouldn't be needed. As the morning progressed, the scene outside Sally's diner changed completely. Bikers worked alongside Mrs. Chen, carefully replanting flowers and arranging displays. 2 of them fixed her broken shop sign. Others apologized to Sally and her customers, their tough exteriors softening in the face of simple kindness and forgiveness. Harold sat on his bench, sipping his coffee from his Marine Corps mug. Sometimes he knew the bravest stand a person could take wasn't one of confrontation, but one of understanding and offering a chance for change. The next few weeks brought changes that surprised everyone in the small town. The parking lot of Sally's Diner, once a place of tension and fear, had transformed into something nobody expected. The familiar rumble of motorcycles still filled the morning air, but now it carried a different meaning. Snake started showing up early, not to cause trouble, but to have coffee with Harold. The old veteran found himself sharing more stories from his years of helping troubled youth at the Veterans Center. Each morning, the biker leader would pull up a chair, his leather jacket creaking as he leaned in to listen. "Tell me more about Uncle Mike," Snake asked one morning, his coffee growing cold as he listened intently. "What was he like when he first came to you?" Harold smiled, remembering the angry young man who had walked into the center decades ago. "Your uncle had the same look in his eyes that I see in yours," Harold replied, watching Snake's reaction carefully. "A good heart hidden behind walls of anger. You just needed someone to show him a different path." Snake nodded slowly, understanding filling his eyes. The other bikers began to change too. Mrs. Chen's flower shop, once their target, became a morning stop for many of them. They would help her unload fresh deliveries, their tattooed arms carefully carrying delicate plants. The elderly woman no longer flinched at the sound of motorcycles. Instead, she would wave and offer them fresh tea. One morning, a group of teenagers was causing trouble outside the hardware store, harassing Mr. Peterson as he set up his display. Before Harold could even stand up, 3 of Snake's riders pulled up, their bikes gleaming in the morning sun. The teenagers scattered quickly, leaving Mr. Peterson's store in peace. "We're watching out for the neighborhood now," Snake explained to Harold later that day. "It feels good. Different than causing trouble, but good." Harold noticed how Snake sat straighter now, pride replacing his former sneer. Inside the diner, business began to boom again. Regular customers returned, but now they shared tables with leather-clad bikers. Jenny, the young waitress, found unexpected support for her college dreams. The bikers started leaving her generous tips, and Snake's group even organized a small fundraiser for her tuition. Harold watched all of this from his usual bench, his Marine Corps mug warm in his hands. Sometimes Frank Miller would join him, shaking his head in amazement at the changes. "Never thought I'd see the day," Frank would say, watching bikers help an elderly lady cross the street. The transformation went beyond just the diner. Snake and several others began visiting the Veterans Center, first just to hear stories about Uncle Mike, but soon they were helping out. They started a program teaching motorcycle maintenance to young veterans, giving them both skills and a sense of community. One morning, Snake arrived looking unusually nervous. He handed Harold a piece of paper, an application for a small business loan. "I want to open a motorcycle repair shop," he explained. "Give kids a place to learn a trade instead of causing trouble. Would you help me with this?" Harold studied the application, noting how carefully it had been filled out. "Your uncle will be proud," he said simply, making Snake stand a little taller. The other bikers gathered around, offering suggestions and support, their leather vests gleaming in the morning sun. Officer Martinez now stopped at the diner regularly, not to check for trouble, but to enjoy coffee with the very people he once watched suspiciously. The bikers would wave to him, sometimes even saving him a parking spot near Harold's bench. Mrs. Chen's flower shop flourished, becoming known for having the strongest delivery service in town. A group of bikers who treated each flower arrangement like precious cargo. Her business doubled, then tripled, as word spread about her unique delivery team. As Harold sat on his bench one morning, watching this new community in action, Sally brought him a fresh cup of coffee. "You knew all along, didn't you?" she asked softly. "You knew they just needed a chance to be better." Harold smiled, his weathered hand steady around his Marine Corps mug. Sometimes the most unexpected turns in life led to the best destinations. The morning sun caught his veteran's pin, making it shine like a beacon of hope for anyone who might need it. 6 months after the confrontation in the rain, Sally's Diner looked very different on an early autumn morning. Harold sat on his usual bench, but he was no longer alone. The once quiet parking lot had become the heart of a transformed community. Snake's motorcycle repair shop, Second Chance Customs, had opened 2 stores down from the diner. The sound of tools and friendly conversation drifted from its open doors, where 3 teenage apprentices were learning the trade under Snake's watchful eye. Harold could see the same pride in Snake's face that he had once seen in Uncle Mike's. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," called one of the apprentices, a young man named Tony who had once been headed for trouble. Now he wore a clean work shirt with the shop's logo, his tools organized neatly in his belt. Harold waved back, remembering how Snake had found Tony trying to steal a motorcycle 2 months ago. Instead of calling the police, Snake had offered him a job. Mrs. Chen's flower shop had become famous in the region. Her window display now proudly showed pictures of her flower angels, leather-clad bikers delivering bouquets throughout the city. She had even started a small garden behind the shop where some of the bikers helped grow fresh flowers, their motorcycles parked nearby while they learned about plant care. Inside the diner, Jenny was serving her last week of tables before heading off to college. The Jenny's Education Fund jar on the counter was filled with donations from bikers and regular customers alike. Snake's group had organized a scholarship fundraiser that had raised enough for her first year's books. "Going to miss you around here, Jenny," Harold said as she brought him his morning coffee. She smiled, adjusting the college acceptance letter she kept pinned to her uniform. "I'll be back on breaks," she promised. "Someone has to keep these guys in line." She gestured to the bikers who now filled the diner each morning. Frank Miller had become a regular again, but now he sat with the bikers, sharing stories about his time in Vietnam. The younger riders listened with respect, asking questions and learning from his experiences. The Veterans Center had never been busier, with bikers volunteering their time to help new veterans adjust to civilian life. Officer Martinez pulled up in his patrol car, but now he was greeted with waves and friendly calls. He joined Harold on the bench, accepting a coffee from Sally. "You know," he said, watching Snake help a customer with directions, "I haven't had a single complaint in this neighborhood for months." Harold nodded, his blue eyes twinkling. "Sometimes people just need to find their true purpose," he said, watching as 2 bikers helped Mr. Peterson unload his morning delivery at the hardware store. The old shopkeeper chatted happily with them, no trace of his former fear remaining. A familiar motorcycle rumbled into the parking lot. It was Mike, Snake's uncle, making his monthly visit from the city. He parked next to Harold's bench, removing his helmet to reveal a proud smile. "The shop looks great," he said to Snake, who had come out to greet him. "Just like I knew it would." Mike turned to Harold, extending his hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for believing in me back then and for believing in my nephew now." Harold shook his hand, remembering the angry young man who had become such a success story. As the morning sun climbed higher, Harold watched the scene before him with satisfaction. Sally's diner was full of customers, both old and new. The sidewalks were busy with people who no longer hurried past in fear. The sound of motorcycles still filled the air, but now they brought comfort rather than concern. Snake sat down next to Harold, holding his own coffee mug. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I always wanted to make a mark on this town. Just never thought it would be like this." He gestured to the thriving businesses, the happy customers, and his successful shop. Harold smiled, his weathered hands steady around his Marine Corps mug. "The best changes in life," he said wisely, "are the ones that lift others up with us." The morning sun caught both their coffee mugs, the steam rising peacefully into the clear autumn air. In the end, the story of the 93-year-old veteran and the bikers became a legend in the small town, not for the conflict that started it, but for the community that grew from it. Harold's bench remained his morning spot, but now it was the heart of a neighborhood where second chances turned into new beginnings, and where the rumble of motorcycles meant help was never far away.